All right, we're going to continue in the book of Daniel. Matter of fact, turn with me, if you would, to Daniel chapter 4. And we're going to talk about this chapter. And if you picked up a note page, those of you that are watching online, you can download the note page either from my own website, donmcgarvey.com, or you can go to the church's Facebook page and download the notes and kind of follow along. But we're going to talk about this chapter. And I think that Daniel chapter 4 is, in my mind, one of the more unusual, maybe one of the strangest, and I'm going to need to sit here for a little while. Too much shoveling this past week. Thank you. The problem is going to be, though, getting up, okay? All right, so, yeah, okay. Matter of fact, I think I'm just going to take care of that
Change
problem
your mind
and
already.
stand up, okay? So Daniel chapter 4 is one of the strangest chapters in the Bible, okay? So I'll give you a spoiler alert here, okay? King Nebuchadnezzar, whom we've met in the first 3 chapters already, spends 7 years on all fours, crawling around like an oxen, like a beast, eating grass, living away, having no contact with people for 7 years. Now, when I talk about that, somebody says, wow, that's just a made-up story. That didn't really happen. And it did happen. Nebuchadnezzar was a real person. God was a real God. And God was dealing with a real problem in Nebuchadnezzar's life. So if you keep your finger in Daniel chapter 4, but turn back to Daniel chapter 1, the very first chapter, because we learn a couple of things in Daniel chapter 1 and then again in Daniel chapter 3 about King Nebuchadnezzar. This guy had an ego as big as all outdoors. He really thought he was something. And in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 10, the servant of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael and Azariah, he's in charge of these young men. And Daniel says, you know, we don't want to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine. Can we just go and live off vegetables and fruit for the next 10 days? And the servant's response was, you make me afraid for my head. He was scared to death that if he did something wrong, that the king would take his head off. And that was the way King Nebuchadnezzar ruled and reigned over all of his constituents. And then if you look in chapter 3, we talked about this a little bit last week, but if you look in chapter 3, it's the story of the fiery furnace. And this time I'll use their Babylonian names, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Jewish young men, Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. They were Jewish young men, and they were supposed to bow down to this figure that Nebuchadnezzar had made. Now, this thing that Nebuchadnezzar had made was 90 to 100 feet high. It was covered in gold, and it was probably 20 to 30 feet wide, and it was out in the middle of this flat plain of land, and everybody had gathered. Nebuchadnezzar demanded that all of his leaders in the nation and his kingdom come out there, and that when the music started, they were supposed to bow down and worship not just the image, but they were to worship King Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, we know the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, no, we're not going to bow down. And of course, then they ended up in the fiery furnace, but God ended up in the furnace with them. Someone made a comment to me at the end of the time that there was a really cool thing that happened while Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the furnace. Another cool thing, just besides the fact that we think God showed up in the furnace with them, but the ropes that they had tied them with came off. What had bound them came off when God showed up in the fiery furnace. And not one hair of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was burned. They didn't smell like smoke, and they came out just fine. But the whole thing stems back to this ego that King Nebuchadnezzar had. And that was what brought about Daniel chapter 4. God wanted to deal with Nebuchadnezzar's ego. Now, Nebuchadnezzar writes chapter 4. It's an interesting setup. Chapter 4 is written in the first person. In other words, it's Nebuchadnezzar's words. And what he does, he uses an old writer's trick, and it's a pretty cool thing. You've probably read books, you've probably watched movies or TV programs, where it starts with the end. Okay? And so we're going to read these first 3 verses because it's the end of the story. But that's how Nebuchadnezzar starts it. And so here's what he says in Daniel chapter 4, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and the wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs! How mighty his wonders! His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Now that doesn't sound like an egomaniac king, does it? What it sounds like is that it's a king who survived 7 years of eating grass because he was so arrogant and he finally had learned his lesson. Now, Bible scholars really feel like that based on these 3 verses that Nebuchadnezzar did come to faith in God. Okay? Now, there's a couple of other places in the scriptures. In Daniel chapter 2, it reads this way. In Daniel chapter 3, it reads this way, that Nebuchadnezzar had an encounter with God. But based on Daniel chapter 4, it really didn't take hold in his life. And so we're going to go through Daniel chapter 4 here a little bit. He starts with the end. And then in verses 4 to 18, we're not going to read all of those verses. We're going to read a few of them. But in verses 4 to 18, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Okay? And he has this dream of this giant tree that is just magnificent, that everybody takes notice of, and that the whole world can gather around this tree. Well, he was the tree. I'll give you a little spoiler alert, okay? And God had chosen to talk to Nebuchadnezzar in this dream. Now, I'm a firm believer that there are times that God chooses, even yet today, to speak to us in dreams. The thing is that you will know whether a dream is from God or not. There are 3 sources of dreams. Number 1 is that God is a source of a dream. Number 2 is that the devil can be a source of a dream. And number 3 is that pizza can be a source for a dream. Okay? All right? And you'll know if it was from God, if it was from the devil, or if it was from too much pizza before you went to bed. You'll know. And when it's God, and somebody asked me one time, well, why do you think God speaks to us in dreams? And I said, well, for some of us, it's the only time our mouth is shut. It's the only time we're listening, is he catches us when we're sleeping. So I want to read some verses out of this section of Scripture, and go down to verse 10 with me. We'll probably read 6 verses, but I just want to set this up, okay? So these were, in verse 10, these were the visions of my head while on my bed. So Nebuchadnezzar's telling us about his dream. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. Remember, he's the tree, all right? And it could be seen to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Verse 13. And then I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one. Now, just interpret, just for the safety's sake at this point, okay? There is a further theological discussion of that word watcher. We're not going to get into it, okay? I have a firm belief about what that word means, but let's just be really safe and say it's an angel, okay? All right. So there was an angel, a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit, and let the beast get out from under it and the birds from its branches. And nevertheless, leave the stump, that's important, leave the stump and the roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beast on the grass of the earth. And let his heart be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. Now, if you had a dream like that, you'd wake up pretty perplexed, pretty frightened by it. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had learned, based on some events in chapter 2, which we didn't talk about, but they're there. Nebuchadnezzar had learned that Daniel, whom he had named Belteshazzar, had a gift from God of being able to not only interpret dreams, but to determine or to tell what a dream was. In chapter 2, very quickly, what happened was that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And he called in all of the wise men of the whole empire, and he wouldn't tell them the dream. He said, if you're so smart, you tell me what I dreamed. Well, they whined and complained, and then Nebuchadnezzar says, look, if you can't tell me what I dreamed and what that dream means, you're all dead. And so everybody was just worried and kind of trying to figure out what to do. And word got to Daniel and to Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, and Daniel says, boys, it's time to pray. And so they prayed. They had a prayer meeting together, the 4 of them, and maybe others, I don't know. But all of a sudden, God began to speak to Daniel and told Daniel what the king's dream was. And not only did he tell him what the dream was, he interpreted the dream. That's all in Daniel chapter 2. Okay? So now, once again, the king has a dream, and he bypasses all the other wise guys in the whole kingdom, and he calls for Daniel, and he says, Daniel, I had another dream. You got to help me. So Daniel helps him. And the interpretation of the dream comes then in verses 19 to 27. We're not going to read all of those, but here's basically what happened. He called for Daniel. Daniel informs the king that the great tree he had seen in his dream was him, and that his kingdom was great, and the whole world knew of his greatness. But the problem was that the king believed he was great. He believed all the press reports. He believed he was really something. My boys had watched a few months ago now, a series, or listened to a series of podcasts regarding some ministries that were going through some really tough times. And one of the leaders of one of these ministries supposedly has made the comment to one of his staff people, I really am a big deal. Well, my boys were wise enough to know, well, that disqualified him right there from being anything God can use. The arrogance, the humility wasn't there. The dependence upon God wasn't there. And when I've worked with pastors, especially pastors who've been around the block a time or two, I will say to them that the real danger that all of us have as we age is that we rely upon our past for our future. We rely upon all of the things that we've learned from our past, and we feel like we've got the answers for everything we face in the future. And my warning to them, and my warning to myself over and over and over is, They never lived in a time like this before, ever in your life. You haven't ever dealt with circumstances like this in our world ever before in your life. You've never dealt with situations, whether it's financial, whether it's morally, whether it's ethical issues. There are some ethical issues that are going to come about in the next few years that all of us as Christians are going to have to deal with. And they're not going to be easy things to deal with. They're going to challenge everything about us. And we're going to need to know, what does God's word have to say to us about this? How should I act? How should I react to this? What's appropriate or what's inappropriate for me? And one of the things that we're going to learn is something that Nebuchadnezzar had not learned before this dream. And the thing that we have to learn is that in and of ourselves, we are not sufficient. We are not smart enough. We can be smart, and we can have had past successes. But none of those things are going to get us any further down the road. I had said something a number of years ago. I barely remember ever saying it. But my friend Steve Wells took what I said and had a plaque made and kept it on his desk. What got you here today is not sufficient for tomorrow. Let me say that again. What got you to here today is not sufficient for tomorrow. You can learn from it. But because tomorrow is going to be a place you've never been before, tomorrow is going to have challenges that you've never faced before. For those of you who teach schools, you got to know that those kids you're working with are going through things, they're facing things on a daily basis that you never dreamed of when you were in their shoes. Those of you that are parents and walking through life with your kids are facing things on a regular basis that you never heard of when you were their age. And so we all have these unique challenges, these different challenges that come along. And what they do is that they scream to us that we need to learn to put our trust in God and not in our own selves, because in our own selves we are not enough. Technology is changing on a minute-by-minute basis. The circumstances in the world, the morality of the world around us is changing on a daily basis. We're having to deal with things in our homes. We're having to deal with things because of the internet and other influences of the media that we've never had to deal with before. And so we have to learn a dependence upon God. That's why I chose to start our service off this morning with Solomon's words about lean not on our own understanding. I don't know about you, but more times than not, I find myself saying, I don't understand that. I don't get that. I don't get that line of thinking. That's foreign to me. That's foreign to anything I've ever learned about logical thinking and processing things. I don't know how to deal with those things. And we can choose to go and run and hide in the corner someplace and not face it, not deal with it. Or we can choose to rise up as what Daniel did in his situations and said, God, I'm going to depend on you. I need your help. I need you to speak to me and to guide me and to show me how it is that I'm to respond so that I can be salt and light and make a difference in your kingdom. I'm convinced as I can be that Daniel was solely responsible for the conversion of King Nebuchadnezzar. That without Daniel, maybe without Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, without those four guys in his life, he never would have come to the knowledge of who God was in his life. And so Daniel begins to warn him. The interpretation of this dream is, King, God has warned you God has warned you and alerted you to the fact that you need to humble yourself. You are a great king, but it's because God has made you great. The whole world knows about you because God has made you great. You're a rich king, you're a mighty king, you're a powerful king, all because of what God has done in your life, and you need to acknowledge him. Well, the cool part about this, and this is a little sidelight. God was ready to pronounce judgment on Nebuchadnezzar, and actually he does. But he didn't take away all the hope. Remember, we read the stump was to be left, and the roots were to be left, that there was hope. And so what happened was the fulfillment of this dream. You can drop down to verses 28 to the 33. One day, a year later, and that's the other thing. God didn't confront Nebuchadnezzar and say, you got 24 hours to change. God is so kind and so gracious. He sustains us. He walks with us. He's patient. He loves us. I would also point out to you that it is not God's will that any of us should ever perish. It's God's will that we would have life, and abundantly and fulfilling and pleasant life that pleases us. John 10:10. But for some strange reason, Nebuchadnezzar ignored the warning. Verse 28, all of this came about on King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months. He was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. And the king spoke and he said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? Well, I don't know what happened in the heavens. I've always told people that there was a heavenly snap, crackle, and pop. Because something snapped in the heavens. And it's a good lesson for us to learn about God. Because God heard Nebuchadnezzar say, I built this kingdom. It's my power for my majesty and for my glory. And something in the heavens snapped. And whenever that something in the heavens snapped, the heart of Nebuchadnezzar was changed from that of a man to that of a beast. And so what happened was, we know that Babylon, the Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar had created, was magnificent. Matter of fact, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, was Nebuchadnezzar's creation. And that's a tough, I don't know exactly what it looked like, but it was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And something snapped, something changed in Nebuchadnezzar's heart, that he went from a heart of a man to the heart of a beast. And for 7 years, he lived on all fours. He crawled around in the fields, just like the other cows and the other oxen and all of the animals out there. And he ate grass for 7 years. And I don't know a lot of the details. I told you everything I know about those 7 years. But I know that at some point, the king came to his senses. How, I don't know. Once again, I would simply say it was the grace and the mercy of God. But he came to his senses. If you look in verse 34, it says that I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. Remember I told you, Nebuchadnezzar wrote this chapter. It's in first person. I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion, not my dominion, but his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom, not my kingdom, but his kingdom is from generation to generation. And he was restored. Matter of fact, he was restored back into his kingdom. And to the best of our knowledge, he died somewhere between chapter 4 and chapter 5. We don't know how long that time was. But to the best of our knowledge, he died giving honor and glory and praise to a holy God who had established him as the king over Babylon. Let me read a couple paragraphs that I wrote. I know this is hard to believe. It's a stretch for some of us to think that a human being would have such a change of heart that for 7 years they lived as a beast. They ate grass. I heard a guy one time, it was kind of funny, at least the way he was dealing with it, that God had been dealing with him about stuff. And he kept ignoring God, and matter of fact, he was a pastor, okay? And he said, finally one day, he says, I was reading Daniel chapter 4. And he says, and I determined I didn't want to eat grass for 7 years. So he said, I came back and I apologized to God, and I admitted to my sinfulness, and I admitted to my pride. I admitted to me thinking that I was all that something. And he said, and I had to come back and I had to say to God, you know, God, it's you. You're the great God. You're the sovereign God. That word sovereign messes with a lot of Christians. The word, when we talk about God being sovereign, it means that he is supreme in power. He is superior to all other beings. Problems arise when we forget this. When I forget the sovereignty of God, when I forget the omniscience of God, when I forget the omnipotence of God, when I forget the omnipresence of God, problems arise. When I begin to think that I'm something, when I begin to think that I could do this without God's help, problems arise. Don't know that we necessarily would go around crawling on our hands and knees until we get a granddaughter, but we don't go around crawling on our hands and knees eating grass. But problems will arise when we forget who God is and we forget who we are. That we are his servant, we are his child, that he is the sovereign God, he is the great God, he is the all-powerful God, all-knowing God, and ever-present God. You know, and I've been thinking about how I wanted to end this, because here's something that I know. People in this room with me now, people watching, people who will be watching, a lot of people who are connected to this church that are not here. I know you're really good at what you do. I know you're successful. Whether it's working with computers, whether it's working with excavation and concrete, whether it's being a diesel mechanic, whether it's being a coach, whether it's being a nurse, whether it's being a farmer, no matter what it is that you do, that you're very good at what you do. I also know you've worked very hard at what you do for a long time. And that you've achieved a level of success, you've achieved a level of notoriety in your field of work. Some in the room have won awards. Some in the room can walk into places that a lot of people can't walk into, where they have places of influence, and they can get things accomplished in areas that some of the rest of us have no influence in at all. And I understand that, and I appreciate that, deeply appreciate that. I respect that. But here's the truth. If it wasn't for God, you wouldn't be able to do that. It's God's grace that has caused you to be strong enough to do the things that you've done. It's God's grace that have caused you to be successful and effective in your places of work, in your wherever you've put your hand to, that God has given you a level of success, a place of influence, and a fulfillment in your life that you wouldn't have known without Him. And it doesn't mean that we're a bunch of weaklings who don't know anything. It just means that we have all benefited from the presence of God, from the grace of God, from the gifts of God in our lives that have been a blessing to us for His purposes. I say this frequently as a source of humor. And you have no idea how serious I am when I say this. The last thing I do before I ever get up to speak, the last thing that goes through my mind is that, God, if you don't help me, these people are in trouble. I study hard. I work hard. I sweat over this one. I know it may not sound like it to you, but I did. But I know that if God doesn't help me, it's not going to work. A few years back, when Coach opened the door for me to step into the FCA Bible study, man, I did that with fear and trepidation, to be honest with you. I prayed, I worked hard in those things, and I would say, God, you have got to help me, because I'm old enough to be every one of these people's grandpa. I was actually older than some of their grandpas, because I've met a few of their grandpas in this thing. But that's the attitude that we've got to take. One of the conversations I had with one of my boys when he was in high school, after one of his classes one night, he was taking his speech class. And he made a mistake one time, and he didn't prepare for the speech. He got it in his head that he could just stand up and do this speech without putting much effort into it. And our conversation on the way home was, I think I learned a lesson tonight, Dad. And I said, you know, it really is comforting to know that you've prepared just as much as you could possibly be prepared when you stand up, and then you really count on God to help you with what you've prepared to do what you're supposed to do. And he said something to me. He says, Dad, do you ever get nervous? I said, every time. And at that time, I was probably speaking and teaching in 4 or 5 different times a week in different preparations. He says, do you ever get nervous? And I said, every time. He said, why? And I said, because I know I'm not the smartest guy on the block. I'm not the best speaker on the block. I know those things. I know there are people out there who could do what I do a whole lot better. I know that. That wouldn't be a hard list to put together. But then I said to him, but they're not here. I am. I'm the one God put here. And it becomes imperative for me to step up and to do the best I can do at all times with God's help. And it was a fascinating conversation. We got home and it was done. Well, we've got to learn how to walk in dependence with God. We've got to learn how to walk in knowing that we've done the best that we can do, And that what we have to offer, we give that to God as our offering to him, and that he takes that then and uses that to challenge the lives of other people. That's how you can end up being salt in places that you wouldn't know how to do that on your own, but God is choosing to use you and your walk with him to make a difference in the lives of individuals. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that. I don't know what was different in Nebuchadnezzar's life after Daniel chapter 4. But I can tell you this much, he learned a lesson. He learned that God had made him that great tree, that God had made it so that everyone looked to him, and God had given him this great kingdom, that God had given him the power and the authority that he ruled over this kingdom. It was God who did these things. And it's the very same God who works in your life and my life. And he has incredible plans for us and how he's going to use us. But we got to forget this is my kingdom, this is my power, this is my dominion, and then we have to come back and say, God, this is your kingdom, this is your sovereignty, this is your power, this is your knowledge, this is your people, and I'm your servant. And so, Father, I pray that you would give us the grace to put our trust in you. You would give us the grace to serve you in those places that you have called us to be salt and light into. And that you will give us the grace, God, to put our trust in you, to walk the path you've prepared, and that we would see your hand at work in our lives, but most of all through our lives, to make a difference in the lives of other people. Help us to learn from what Nebuchadnezzar wrote to us in Daniel chapter 4, to put our trust in you, to give ourselves wholly to you each and every day. And we'll give you praise and we'll give you thanks now. In the name of Jesus, amen.